Picture this. You walk into church after a grueling day of work. You're exhausted, you're hungry, and you find the wealthy members already drunk, the food already gone. That's not a hypothetical. That happened in the earliest Christian churches, and the Apostle Paul was furious about it. So how did we get from that scene to the ritual you might know today? Let's rewind. The Eucharist, from the Greek word for thanksgiving, wasn't always a small wafer and a sip of wine. In the first century, it was a full communal dinner. Believers gathered in someone's home, shared real food and real drink, and somewhere during the meal, the host spoke the words of Jesus, "This is my body, this is my blood." The entire evening was the worship service. Now consider who filled these rooms. Early Christians met in house churches, private homes, not purpose-built buildings. The host was typically someone with modest wealth, a householder, maybe a small business owner, but most members were poor laborers, freedpersons, and slaves. When multiple house churches gathered for a larger communal meal, these social differences didn't disappear, they collided. Here's where the scandal takes shape. Wealthy members had control over their own schedules. They arrived around 5 in the evening, bringing food and wine. They started eating and drinking immediately. Workers and slaves had no such freedom. They couldn't leave their obligations until sundown, around 7. By the time they walked through the door, the food was consumed and some of the hosts were drunk. Paul describes it bluntly. One goes hungry and another becomes drunk. He even coins terms for the two groups, hoi echonte, the haves, and the tous me echontes, the have-nots. This is Paul's own language, not a modern imposition. But Paul doesn't just describe the problem, he diagnoses it, and his diagnosis is sharper than you might expect. He writes directly to the wealthy members, "Do you not have homes to eat and drink in, or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing?" Notice what Paul targets. He's not telling them to stop having meals together. He's not anti-feasting. His objection is exclusion. These wealthy patrons treated the communal meal like a private dinner party. They used their social advantage, flexible schedules, access to food, to eat first and eat well, while the people the meal was supposed to unite went hungry. Paul calls that contempt. He calls it humiliation. Now comes the most misunderstood phrase in this entire passage. Paul warns the Corinthians about eating and drinking without discerning the body. For centuries, many traditions read this as a mystical statement that believers must recognize Christ's spiritual presence in the bread and wine before consuming them. But look at Paul's argument in context. He's not talking about the theology of the elements, he's talking about people. The body is the community of believers. To eat without recognizing and caring for the other members of Christ's body, especially the poor, is to eat judgment on yourself. The failure is social, not sacramental. Paul goes even further. He claims that some Corinthians have fallen ill or died because of this abuse. Whether literal or rhetorical, the point is unmistakable. Communal fracture along class lines isn't a minor etiquette problem. Paul treats it as a spiritual crisis, though Paul's solution sounds simple. Wait for one another. If you're hungry, eat at home first. But the implication is radical. The people who must change are the ones with power. The wealthy adjust their behavior. The comfortable sacrifice their convenience. This isn't an isolated ruling. It's a pattern that runs through the entire letter. 3 times in 1 Corinthians, Paul applies the same principle. At the Lord's Supper, wealthy members must wait for poor members. In the idle meat debate of chapters 8 through 10, knowledgeable members must refrain if eating harms a weaker member's conscience. With spiritual gifts in chapters 12 through 14, tongues, speakers must yield to orderly worship for the whole assembly. Every time those with more power voluntarily limit themselves for the vulnerable. The earliest Christians didn't separate worship from justice. The meal was both. Those with more power, more flexibility, more resources were expected to adjust for those with less. And here's one final thought. The Eucharist eventually shrank from a full meal to a symbolic ritual, perhaps partly because the full meal format kept exposing the very inequalities it was supposed to transcend.